This is Word on the Streets, a podcast about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. This podcast is created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of Word on the Streets, a podcast about information, updates, and perspective on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project in Midland, Michigan. I'm your host, Katie Geyer, here with my co-host, Grant Merschel. Grant, we have been doing this now for a year.
That's exciting.
We are in Season 2.
We are.
Pretty awesome.
For sure.
Remember, for all of our listeners, if you're listening for the first time, you can go back and listen to previous episodes of this podcast by searching MCTV Government Affairs on your favorite podcast app. You can also watch them and look at our shining faces in person on YouTube, on the City of Midland's channel, or you can watch and listen to them on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV via the free MCTV Network app. You can also find all these previous episodes in video format and extra tidbits from every episode at cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. Okay, let's get started officially with Season 2.
Welcome to Season 2.
I know. So today's topic we're going to be discussing is actually a great segue to a new season and to a new year as we focus on what's kind of happening next with Buttles and Indian on this podcast. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about updates on that project specifically. Do we have any updates from Mndot on how that's going right now?
So the last thing we've heard from Mndot is some additional data that they've received from us. They've gone through and done preliminary survey work. They've done some pedestrian counts within the corridor, which I know we've highlighted here in this podcast before. And they're continuing to work behind the scenes on the design. And need a little bit more information from us this year, which we'll talk about in this episode. Yep. But things are progressing on their side of things, and they are continuing to work to design both Buttles and Indian for the future.
Exciting stuff. So this podcast is about one-way corridors, as we've talked about pretty extensively last season, Indian and Buttles, but those are actually not the only one-way pairs that we have in the community that handle pretty significant both motorized and non-motorized traffic. We also have Ashman and Rodd. Tell us a little bit about Ashman and Rodd streets, Grant.
Sure. So Ashman and Rodd, as you said, are also one-way pairs currently. They were designed in order to connect the downtown area to the city's second business district, which is Saginaw Road and the Circle area, now known as the Center City area, because of course that incorporates the city's Center City Authority boundaries. Mm-hmm. So Ashman and Rodd connect downtown into a portion of the city that was developed shortly after downtown was developed and allowed for a pretty clear vehicle connection point between those two areas of the city that have existed for a number of years.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of things. If you travel along those corridors, say you're not from Midland, for example, we've got a pretty eclectic mix of things that are along those corridors. We've got a brand new, beautiful STEM school that's in, I think it's fourth or fifth year of operation.
That's correct.
We have Grove Park, which has become such a focal point for the Midtown neighborhood, which is kind of that area between downtown and Center City that's really come into its own with its own identity. Lots of residential properties, lots of small business properties in there. What does the zoning look like in those areas between Ashman and Rodd?
Yeah, so you mentioned eclectic mix of different types of facilities and institutions and businesses. When you look at the zoning map currently, it is also a bit of an eclectic mix because for those of our listeners that maybe remember Midland many decades ago, there was a railroad spur that actually connected into that part of the city, and so like Cahoon's Elevator and a couple of other facilities were intentionally located around that railroad spur that has since been abandoned for a number of years. But we still have some industrial zoning in that area. We have some commercial zoning around down the Mattress Man and Live Oak Coffee House and Ashman Plaza. We also have some office service, which is in areas of, we have a few dentists and attorneys' offices right along Ashman Street, for example. But then we have a lot of residential zoning in and around that area. And then when you get closer to actually the intersection of Ashman, Rodd, and Indian, we do have our brand new missing middle housing zoning district, the RB2, one in multiple family residential zoning.
That's exciting. There's lots of stuff going on in there. Like we said before, Midtown's really coming into its own. Downtown and Center City obviously are a little bit more established. So these corridors are super important as we consider kind of what the future of Midland is really going to look like over the next 20, 30 years.
Absolutely.
So why are we talking about this? Well, Midland City Council had its annual planning retreat on Saturday, January the 8th. And that is a meeting where every year council hears from staff about some of the key projects that are going to be coming up over the next calendar year that they can be prepared for. So Ashman and Rodd and their future were on that council agenda. Tell us about what happened, Grant.
Sure. So staff brought forward this discussion because there's a number of reasons why Ashman and Rodd needs to be discussed in greater detail for the future of those corridors. First, the Downtown Development Authority did vote back when they adopted their streetscape plan in 2018, I believe it was. Actually, 2016, now that I think about it.
Yep. It's been that long. Can you believe it?
Right. So at that time, they did consider both Ashman and Rodd in the downtown area and wanted to see them be restored back to two-way traffic for a variety of purposes, largely to improve connectivity in and out of downtown. Excuse me. The other conduit, or not really conduit, but catalyst for the consideration is the Center City redevelopment plan in the Circle area and then down Saginaw Road. There's plans within that redevelopment area for the both one-way or two-way restoration of Ashman and Rodd, and so there is a need for us to have an answer on the future of Ashman and Rodd as we look forward to second phase of the Center City redevelopment plan, which includes the Circle area.
Yeah, and that is another really exciting project. We will probably talk about that streetscape project at some point this season, if not this season. Hopefully if we have a season 3 of this project, because
Sure.
Buttles and Indian will be a long-term project that we've said will span multiple years. So
Correct.
That's something that we will be talking about most likely on this podcast as well, because they do complement each other quite a bit. And that's a really exciting topic we're going to cover as well.
Absolutely. And then related back to Indian and Buttles is Mndot's need to actually have an answer from the city by May or June of this year on what Ashman and Rodd's design in the future will look like. So whether we'll keep them as one-way pairs or whether the city wants to restore them back to two-way traffic, that's something that Mndot does need in order to consider moving forward with their plans for Indian and Buttles.
Yeah, that's why what I was going to say next is why now? Why are we having this conversation now?
Sure.
People in the community have probably heard this talked about for a number of years. You just mentioned that the DDA has already addressed that in some format. And really, as it relates to this podcast, it's because we need to start making some decisions as we look at what the future intersections of Ashman and Rodd with Buttles and Indian are going to look like. So,
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the fun stuff, which is the why. When we first tackled this project on Buttles, we spent a ton of time talking about the why behind why Buttles was originally designed the way it was as a 3-lane one-way corridor, and as well as Indian, as well as the future design and why we would like to see that reduced to 2 lanes, because I think context is super important. And if you go back and listen to our episode 8 from last season, we talked literally about designing roads differently depending on the context around them, with Mndot's John Martin, which is the CSS coordinator. So if you haven't checked out that episode, definitely go back and listen to that one as well, because I think it's really important to understand what we're talking about when we say context-sensitive design.
Yep.
So why were Ashman and Rodd designed as one-ways in the first place?
Sure. So Ashman and Rodd really were the product of the same type of way of thinking that allowed us to result in like Indian and Buttles being one-ways and being 3 lanes in each direction. There was history within the way that cities were planned, especially in the middle parts of the last century, where there was really intentionality around getting cars from point A to point B as fast as possible.
Yep.
The modernism at the time in the mid-century was about segregating uses out so that you had residential districts, you had commercial districts, you had downtown districts, you had industrial districts, and they all should really be separated and be designed in a way that you can easily get from point A to point B in your vehicle as fast as possible. In order to facilitate that in a very meaningful way, you do add capacity by being able to change 2-way streets to 1-way streets. You can gain a great amount of capacity and speed of movement for vehicles by doing that type of road design. Understanding that history and why we've gone in that direction and why cities all over the country went in that direction is very important, because it really rationalizes the thought process at the time and why it makes sense. However, cities change and people change and the desire of communities change. and where people want to live and how close they want to live to certain types of services and amenities and the mixture of those uses and things, that continues to evolve, and we have to be okay with taking a look at what the new and modern needs of the city are today compared to what they were back in the 1970s and 60s when we were doing more conversions at the time.
Yeah, we've talked about it as well on this podcast previously with Buttles and Indian, that whole motordom way of thinking, where it was getting people and particularly vehicles, from one place to another as quickly as possible, not really considering too much the surrounding context of that roadway. So as we continue with this podcast, we'll be talking a lot more about that and what that looks like. For right now, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 1 of Word on the Streets. Just as a friendly reminder, you can listen to this podcast by searching MCTV Government Affairs on your podcast platform of choice. You can also watch video versions of this podcast on the City of Midland's YouTube channel, as well as on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV by searching for the free MCTV Network app. Today, we're discussing the future of another set of one-way pairs beyond Indian and Buttles, Ashman and Rodd streets. So, Grant, let's get back into this. Converting Ashman and Rodd to two-way changes the experience for all road users, whether you're a motorist, a pedestrian, anybody that's going to be utilizing that road, but especially important in downtown Midland. So, as we kind of talked about earlier, the DDA actually discussed and supported changing Ashman and Rodd to two-way streets. Why is that particularly of concern to the DDA, and why did they decide to make such a big change in this area?
Sure. So the DDA decision was really within the overall thought into the redevelopment plans for downtown across their entire street network. So at the time that the 2016 redevelopment plan and streetscape plan was approved, we then went forward and we did the brand new streetscape of Main Street, which was a very intentional redesign to move it from a majority of a design for cars more to a design for people. And when I say people, I mean people that are walking and biking, maybe taking e-scooters like we saw in the last year, gathering around one another. We didn't know at the time when we did that brand new streetscape that it was going to be so transformative and so influential in restaurants, especially being successful through the pandemic that we're now within. But it allowed people to be able to congregate and to gather in a way that was very different than how it was designed previously. Thinking more holistically or more comprehensively around the entire downtown district, there was an interest of wanting to look at how can people get in and out of downtown, and is there a missing opportunity by the way that we've designed our streets, and have we made it more complex than it really needs to be in order for people to get in and out of downtown? What we see is the vast majority of downtown users that are arriving by vehicle access the district coming in from two primary areas. It's Ashman coming in from Buttles and Indian, and it's Main Street coming in from Jerome or M20. Outside of that, there's very little options, and for those that have lived in Midland for a number of years, sure, there's McDonald, and there's Townsend, and there's Cronkite, and there's George, and others that can get you into downtown or can leave downtown like on Rodd. But it does take a little bit of interest or interest or really know-how in order to navigate that kind of complex one-way pair system.
Sure.
And just as an anecdote, I know a lot of times DDA was talking about if you're standing at the corner of Townsend and Main in front of Riverside Place or right by the Mexican restaurant or some of those other businesses that are there, if someone were to say, how do I get to Smith's Flowers on Ashman Street in front of Kroger? And that's one primary example, which I think does a good job of really creating the idea or the giving a prime example of how complex it is to actually get to the circle and then over to some of those other businesses because of the one-way nature of the systems. So that was really kind of the issue that they was trying to solve by the DDA. Alternatively, or not really alternatively, but in addition to that, they wanted to look at just adding connectivity and recognizing that if you have a business on a one-way street, you get traffic that's going in one direction, but you're not getting traffic that's going in the other direction. And for downtown businesses, it's important to have vehicle users be able to have easy access and pedestrians that are out on the sidewalks walking from place to place. But if you're only going to get 50% of the traffic because they're going in one direction, you really are leaving a number of patrons or a number of people that would pass your business on the table. And so the downtown knew that the best practice was to try and convert one ways back to two ways in order to boost connectivity and people's ability to be able to connect to businesses more and more.
That makes total sense. And I'm glad you brought up the streetscape and how it's really evolved even since the pandemic, because one of the things that the DDA pursued that kind of came out of that pandemic was the concept of the pedestrian plazas. So what we actually have done for the last couple of years and is going to be coming up in 2022, hopefully as well, is the closing of Main Street from Ashman to Rodd to vehicle traffic completely. And this all lends itself to connectivity because McDonald Street closes and no longer becomes that two-way thoroughfare through downtown.
Right.
So right now, if you were to look at the map, you have a one-way going down in Ashman Street to the Tridge Farmers Market area, and and Rodd Street one-way coming out. If those were to go to two-way, that allows for a lot less confusing, honestly, pathway in and out of downtown, especially when you don't have that cross-section going down Main Street or using McDonald Street. So that's just another thing that I think probably we are going to be considering, and the DDA definitely is considering as we look at, what does the future of our downtown look like from a long-term perspective.
It is. And it's also about maximizing assets that we have in our downtown, too. One thing that we know for certain with the Larkin parking ramp that's at Rodd Street and Larkin, Ellsworth, and Townsend, number of people in Midland have commented on they did not know that there was a parking garage there.
Yep.
Or when they come into downtown and they look at other parking lots and they say, wow, it's really busy down here and I don't know if I'm going to find a parking space. We don't have a high utilization of the parking ramp, large part because it's designed on a corridor that's meant to take you out of downtown in Rodd Street. And so it's an afterthought. As you come into downtown and you're moving your way into the downtown on Ashman Street, for example, you really don't think of going over to that ramp on Rodd because that's more of the thing you pass as you're leaving downtown.
Sure.
And so thinking through intentionally around the design does reinforce behavior of motorists, and it also determines whether or not certain assets are going to get maximized because of how the design of the street is around them.
Sure. So there's obviously a lot of things to consider as the DDA supported this and as we look at what the future of downtown looks like. But speaking of changes overall, we are also going through the City Modern Master Plan update right now. So how does this entire process and the future of Ashman and Rodd play into that, and what kind of considerations are we going to make going forward for the rest of the community?
Sure. So I think City Modern does provide a background for understanding the community in a way that is building off of the things that we've known for a number of years. City Modern in the master plan work that we're doing now is not a let's start everything from scratch.
Right.
There are opportunities for us to continue to build on the momentum that has been successful and what we've been hearing from the community to large degree about what type of changes they want to see. In addition to the public input and the desires of the community that we're gathering, we also have to be very mindful through City Modern about what long-term sustainability looks for the community. And not to get too far down into the weeds, I guess, on how all of this connects, but the long-term financial sustainability of the city and how we derive revenues through taxes and through user fees of utilities and how we pay for all of the infrastructure that we have is largely a product of what is our total liability, which usually is multiplied out through some type of geographic means. So total square footage or total land area of our service area. And then what's our overall value within that service area. If we've built a lot of things that have very little value, but they expand our service area and they extend all of our utilities and our streets and our curbside collection services, for example, but they don't pay for it all through the tax revenues, we're creating ourselves a very unsustainable model. And part of that is really where the flaw of motordom lies and really suburbanization in general. Because what usually ends up happening and what we're kind of witnessing is there's not the political will or the intent or the desire of the community to be able to pay the high rates of taxes that it takes to sustain a very low dense system.
Sure.
And Midland, as we've talked about, I think on this podcast, is actually the top It's the 5th largest city in square footage and area-wise in the state of Michigan, but not even in the top 25 in population.
Right, yep.
And so we've created a very auto-oriented, low-density city that takes a lot of resources to maintain all of that. The way that you add improved sustainability into that model is actually intensifying redevelopment within the core parts of your city that have already been developed and have already received some type of service delivery through utility extensions or street extensions, or the build out of all of that infrastructure that's necessary to support new development.
Sure.
So City Modern, and we'll see a little bit more here in the next few weeks when we unveil results of an Urban 3 analysis around economic productivity and really quantifying all of these concepts that I'm talking about. City Modern is really telling us that we need to, and from a variety of angles, we need to continue to invest in that core part of the city. When you look at the map, Ashman and Rodd is really in the crosshairs of where that core part of the city is.
Right. No, that's a great point, too, because a lot of people consider growth to be as your city expands outwards. And like you said, in some ways, that's actually detrimental. And some of the most smart development is actually infill and redeveloping those existing properties that are already within your core. And if you look at Midland on a map, Ashman and Rodd play such a vital part of the community, and not just from a perspective of transportation, but also just within the identities of the neighborhoods and the things that that are surrounding them. So
it's true. And one other piece, I guess, to dive into this or to jump in and kind of add a little bit to would be desirability around what people are looking for in current living opportunities. The highest value and the most desirable neighborhoods across the state and across the nation at the moment are walkable urban environments. And when we think of Midland, we don't necessarily call ourselves urban.
Right.
We maybe think of ourselves as more of a suburban type of community, and we are to a large degree, but there are more urban parts of our community, and you can create urban walking environments in different pockets of a community. You don't have to just focus on downtown or just on midtown or just on center city. You can create that kind of density that supports those types of lifestyles and amenities in other parts of your city too, which kind of to tie a lot of this more together, we've had those conversations around like the Midland Mall area, for example, and wanting to introduce mixed use in those particular parts of the city in order to obtain that type of environment. Because, again, it's not only sustainable and a good return on investment for the local government, but it's also something that's being desired more and more by people. And if we want Midland to be a community of choice for people to come and live and to retire or to work or to raise families or to do all the things that people want to do, we need to be able to continue to evolve and change and maintain that level of a community of choice that we have had for a number of years. Yeah,
that's a good point. We are not the only community that is looking at these kinds of things. We're not the only community that could potentially do something with great success. So if you go to the podcast website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors, we're going to put some links to some other examples and just some best practices, especially from the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It's we call it NACTO typically. Some great case studies and some other communities that are really have already gone through this and have seen great success with it. I also have some anecdotal experience too, actually. My hometown, Kokomo, Indiana. Shout out to my fellow Hoosiers that are listening to us right now. Hopefully at least someone is. They started converting several of their downtown one-ways starting back as early as 2012, very similar to the way that we are approaching now looking at Ashman and Rodd. Just like we've talked about so much on the podcast already, those one-ways have become extremely automobile-centric, very unfriendly for pedestrians. They were either surrounded by business districts or by residential neighborhoods, but because they had been so automobile-centric, speeds were high, conditions were not conducive to safe pedestrian use, safe non-motorized use. And so the city kind of took a step back and said, do these even need to be one way? Did the work, did the studies, and determined, these could function very easily as a two-way street, and it makes way more sense to do that way. They'd been designed that way, like post-Cold War era, for a number of different reasons. And so they started doing that as early as 2012 through 2016. And now you see a corridor that is much more pedestrian friendly, allows those downtown businesses a lot more access to everyone in the community, not just someone who has a vehicle. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast. Not everyone, even in Midland, owns a vehicle, has access to a vehicle. may not even have reliable access to public transportation. That's something that we talk about a lot on the podcast too, expanding those networks, and just making things safer for pedestrians and non-motorized users and all members of the community, ultimately, whether you're in a vehicle or not, to utilize those residential and commercial areas. So something that I remember hearing, being a part of that community, and I'm sure we've heard it in the past and we'll continue to hear it here, what about safety? What about people that have lived here their whole lives that have only known those streets as a one-way? I can say, as someone who grew up in Kokomo, learned to drive on those streets, took driver's training on those streets, dating myself just a tiny bit, and then moved away for over a decade, and then actually returned willingly to the community to work and live there, and came back to there being converted from a one-way that I had known to a two-way. It was a very easy transition for me. I never turned the wrong way down the street that used to be a one-way, didn't have any issues, and they really didn't see any issues either. So let's talk a little bit about that and how you combat those safety issues that could potentially arise.
Sure. So with any type of change like this, there's always going to be a learning curve. We know that in anything that we do.
Yeah.
When there's something that people have to adjust to, whether that's a brand new stop sign or a brand new other traffic control measure that the city has, there's always going to be some type of learning curve.
Sure.
But there's intentionality around why we would want to make that change, and that's the process that we're embarking on, is to really weigh the pros and the cons as to whether or not this makes sense when you look at it from a comprehensive or a holistic type of approach. So on the safety piece, one thing I do want to point out is at the moment we don't exactly have a safety or a foolproof type of situation.
Sure.
Anyone that has been in downtown in the last few years, and I've been on Ashman in particular, we have a lot of really bad wrong way drivers.
Yeah.
If you're in some of the restaurants or tap rooms on Ashman Street, or in a coffee house that's on that particular part of the street, you don't have to sit there very long, especially during busy parts of the day, to see a vehicle going the other way mistakenly. And it is quite, it creates quite a challenging safety situation currently with the one-way system. Now, is that rationale on its own to be able to say, let's go back to two-way to solve that issue? No, we really need to look at a full matrix of reasons of why we'd want to do that. But we do have to understand that just changing it and being concerned about the changes and the struggle of people adopting to it, that in and of its own really isn't good rationale to say no to something like this too.
Sure. Yeah, that's a perfect point as well. Is just like converting from one ways to two ways provides challenges. Having existing one ways, especially in your busier districts, does pose some challenges as well. We do see people going the wrong way down Ashman, especially quite frequently.
Yep.
So what are the next steps in this whole process? What is it going to look like? What can residents expect to see, and when will more information on this be available?
Sure. So the next steps in this process is actually going to be taking a report from staff back to City Council at one of their upcoming meetings to have the discussion around process. So Council gave the go-ahead for us to embark on going forward with this process. We need to formalize what those steps are going to look like.
Okay.
City staff has the know-how to be able to take a project on like this, but we don't have the capacity at the moment to be able to do it with other things that we have on our plates too. So we will be looking with the approval of council to go out for an RFP and get outside consulting assistance to assist us. One particular element that we don't have in staff at the moment would be the traffic modeling that's necessary to go along with a conversion discussion like this. So that's part of the process, would be to hire the outside consulting assistants. We would then go back to the community through stakeholder meetings and public meetings. Big stakeholders in this particular discussion, of course, will be residents that live in Midtown, businesses that are located on Ashman and Rodd, and other kind of institutional uses that either are on Ashman and Rodd or immediately adjacent to them. We want to hear the feedback from them. But we also want to propose some options for them to be able to react to, as opposed to coming just in a conceptual type of way. So that's going to be part of the process once we get some design possibilities to be able to float through that before we bring it back to council for a final vote, and City Council would have the final approval on this.
Sure.
One thing I do want to point out, and it is a question that's come up already, is what's Mndot's position on this, which is something I know we discussed in Indian and Buttles quite heavily.
Yeah.
Ashman and Rodd are not MDOT streets. They are fully city jurisdiction.
Right.
And so we do not have a recommendation from MDOT, and we won't have a recommendation from MDOT. So this is solely a city type of project. And I think as we go forward, we really have to look holistically at the entire approach in order to know which decision is going to be either given the recommendation or be considered by City Council once we look at it from a variety of angles.
Sure. So there's still a lot to come in this process. Sounds like there's going to be quite an extensive amount of work that's going to go into this. This is not going to be a very easily fly-by-night type of decision. This is something that takes a lot of engineering work, takes a lot of thought, and of course takes a lot of community input, because that's extremely important to these types of projects. So this is really our first major public in-depth discussion other than council's retreat on this. So this is the first time that a lot of people may be hearing this in a lot of detail, which is pretty exciting.
It is.
So
the one thing I guess if I could jump into to add, which is it is exciting, and it gives us an opportunity to really think about what's the modern needs of Midland now. There was great excitement in the community around modernism in the middle part of the last century. I mean, mid-century modern as architecture, for example, was something that Midland has a rich history in. But that's because at the time there was a host of other ways that the city was thinking about modern expansions and modern ways of doing things at the time. This is a project that does really represent the idea of being able to rethink areas to meet new and modern needs. And I think one thing that is going to be important for staff to really dive deeper into and get some concrete thought around is how do we approach this in a very comprehensive and a very context-sensitive type of way, thinking through, as I've talked about, sustainability as one. Connectivity is another thing that we need to think a lot about. There's the non-motorized transportation and the balancing of the street between all user groups, which is equity at the end of the day.
Sure.
And so it's a very exciting project. And I think what I hope doesn't happen is the community think, oh, geez, this is just another type of contentious debate that we're going to launch in around something like this. Instead, I would really hope to position it as something that does offer us an opportunity to really think about the future of Midland and what's going to meet the best needs for the future, and provide the right kind of roadways that's going to be the very best thing for the community.
Sure, and a lot of what you just mentioned, non-motorized connectivity, context-sensitive design, we've already had all those conversations around Indian and Buttles. So it's kind of extending that thought process out into other roadways in our community and really taking that next step, like you said, to be more modern. We are the city of modern explorers. We have to keep modernly exploring how we deliver services and just the way that our community looks, feels, and operates. I mean,
that's correct.
That's just a part of being a community of choice, like you said before.
Yep.
So that is all we have for today. That was a lot, since we said this is our first public major discussion about Ashman and Rodd. But there will be a lot more exciting stuff coming down the pike. And as we get more updates as well, we can always revisit this in future episodes. I'm sure we will, since it does impact the Indian and Buttles corridor as well. We will always put links to all of this information on the podcast website, which is cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. So make sure you're checking that out to get some additional links. You will see some more information about some previous communities that have done very similar stuff to what we're talking about right now. So you can kind of get a better conceptual understanding of why some other communities have chosen to go this route as well.
Correct.
So as we get more updates from City Council and we move kind of through this process, there will be updates on that website, and we'll talk about it in future episodes. So that is it for this installment, but we will be back next month with another episode. More updates on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. See you soon, and slow down. This has been Word on the Streets, a podcast created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. For more information on this podcast or to learn more about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project, visit cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors.